World War I induced widespread change across Europe. In Russia, millions of troops had been killed in the war, and the people became unhappy with the Tsarist government that had ruled over them for centuries. Beginning in 1919, a new type of government rose in the area. It was titled communism and was created by the philosopher Karl Marx and put into practice by Russia's Bolshevik Party under Lenin. The Western nations began to fear communism, thinking it could become too powerful and overrun them. Because of this fear, the United States and other Western nations sponsored the White Army, which fought against the Nationalist Red Army during the ongoing Russian Civil War. Eventually, however, the White Army lost to the Red Army's superior numbers, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, came into existence. The White Army's failure did nothing to quell the Americans' fear of communism, and soon President Wilson authorized A. Mitchell Palmer to conduct what became known as the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids were a series of sweeps conducted by the U.S. officials to root out any communist sympathizers and arrest them. The Palmer Raids succeeded in arresting thousands of immigrants and people suspected of having communist ties. These raids were not always peaceful, and many did not go quietly. This sent a message to the USSR that the US would not tolerate communism, and created a mutual hatred between the two nations. In both, propaganda was flooded onto the media to influence the thinking of their respective peoples. Before World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had a rocky relationship. This began with the rise of communism and the subtle conflict that arose with it. The conflict between communism and the capitalism of democracy was put on hold when the threat of Nazi fascism arose. At this time, the countries put aside their differences in a compromise that lasted until the looming threat of Nazi domination had been dealt with.
June 22, 1941. World War II has been raging for 2 years. After making significant gains early on in Western Europe, Hitler's blitzkrieg abruptly changed directions as he decides to launch a surprise attack on his newly acquired ally Stalin. Before the start of the war, the two dictators had signed a non-aggression pact, which stated that neither party would attack the other. Thus, the USSR made enemies of Britain, France, and in turn the US. After large gains by the combined force in Finland and Poland, the Nazis turned on their new ally and attacked. Although all of the nations involved in the war expected the betrayal eventually, no one suspected that the truce would be broken so early on, and thus the Soviet Union was taken aback by the attack titled Operation Barbarossa. Although over 5 million in number, the poorly equipped and poorly trained Red Army was no match for Hitler's superior army, and soon the Red Army was being chased across their own territory by the Nazi war machine. After a short time, the USSR began begging for Allied assistance, and soon the United States initiated the Lend-Lease Act. Although it meant helping their former enemies, the U.S. realized that the Nazis were truly a greater threat than the communists could ever be, and so decided to aid them in their defense of their motherland. The Lend-Lease Act was the direct response to the USSR's plea for help, canceling the former neutrality acts of the 1930s that prohibited America from selling goods to any nation at war. The U.S. began to ship massive amounts of food and weaponry to the Soviet Union. This greatly aided the Soviet defense and helped them stem the Nazi invasion. In the time that the Nazis battled the Communists on the Eastern Front, the U.S. was attacked in Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, the other allies of the Nazis. Only a day after the attack, President Roosevelt declared war, bringing the U.S. officially into World War II. In little over a year, the Nazis had conquered several hundred miles of Soviet territory and had made their way to the city of Stalingrad. Joseph Stalin decided that it was here that his country would make their stand against fascism. Armed with the weapons sent by the Allies through the Lend-Lease Act, Stalin threw everything into the city's defense. For over 5 months, the two forces battled over what eventually became bombed-out ruins. When the dust settled, the Soviets had won, but at the cost of 90% of their city and over 1 million lives. The Germans surrendered after losing 250,000 of their own soldiers and having to endure the harsh Russian winter with their inadequate summer uniforms and dwindling supplies. Stalin's victory in Stalingrad led him to the belief that the battle symbolized a turning point in the war. He urged the rest of the Allies to take their attacks in North Africa and Italy to the next step by launching an assault in Western Europe. And so, with the assurance of Stalin that the Nazis had finally begun to weaken, the U.S. and Britain began to prepare what became the largest land and sea invasion in history, entitled Operation Overlord. On June 6, 1944, the largest fleet ever assembled got the order from the Allied leaders to begin their attack on Normandy, France, in an attempt to gain a foothold on occupied Europe. After fierce fighting and thousands of casualties against entrenched Germans, the Allies took the beach and accomplished the task. The battle known as D-Day was the Allies' first push into France. This engagement, known as the Normandy Breakout, came at a very high cost for both sides. The U.S. troops, while being highly trained and well-equipped, were not very experienced, especially not in the kind of warfare they encountered in France. Normandy is characterized by its large open areas fenced in by natural occurring mounds of dirt and brush called hedgerows. During their lengthy occupation of France, the Nazis had plenty of time to develop intricate defense systems in the area, complete with multiple fallback positions, zeroed artillery, and entrenched armor units. The first few days after D-Day proved to be catastrophic for the Allies, as they had to adapt to the new style of hedgerow warfare. In many cases, battles were not won by infantry alone, but usually with the help of numerous ways the Allies had of supporting them, such as stationary guns or the Air Force. The Allied Air Force in particular played a huge role in the fight against Germany. During the course of the war, the Allies would continuously launch sorties deep into Germany to attack strategic locations such as supply depots or factories. This disrupted the flow of supplies to both fronts and helped the US and the USSR equally in their eventual victory over Germany.
The successful retaking of France by the Allies proved Stalin right in thinking that Stalingrad was the turning point in the war. On the Eastern Front, many Nazi divisions were pulled away to join the fight against the growing threat of the US and Britain and France. This gave Stalin's forces an easier time in defeating the German soldiers left behind to defend the recently conquered Soviet territory. In a short span of time, Russian soldiers took back all the land that was seized by the Third Reich and sent the Nazis retreating back to secure Axis territory. It is at this point that both Stalin and British leader Winston Churchill predicted certain victory for the Allies. Churchill began to urge the U.S. to engage the Nazis more aggressively, in order to reach the capital of Germany, Berlin, before the Red Army. The U.S., however, was wary of British intentions and so decided to take the attack slower to secure a safer peace. This led to both forces eventually meeting in Germany. In Stalin's conferences with the other leaders, he began to look ahead to after the war, what his country would receive for all the struggles they had endured against the German forces. Upon arriving in Berlin, the leaders of the Allies met at the Potsdam Conference. Afterwards, an American diplomat congratulated Stalin on having made it so far as to have Russian soldiers in Berlin. He replied, "Tsar Alexander I made it all the way to Paris." This thirst for power led to the conference setting the political stage in Europe for decades after the war. Now that the threat of Nazi fascism had been erased, the United States and the USSR reverted back to their ways of passively hating one another. However, from a political standpoint, things were now different. While taking enormous tolls on both human and economic costs, the war had caused the USSR and US to emerge as the world superpowers, which spurred a rivalry unknown to the world before. It became known as the Cold War and descended into an arms race that continued decades after the Second Great War ended.
Having to practice getting under the desk. I made these little drills like fire drills. So if you see a flash, get under the desk and keep your head covered up and try to stay away from the windows. I actually had summer jobs that were in the defense industry. And we studied what would happen if the eastern seaboard were subject to a nuclear attack with hydrogen bombs. The study actually concluded that there was really very few places you could hide, and the fallout shelter program probably wasn't going to work.
For 45 years, the world held its breath, and somehow, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided nuclear war. 45 years of stockpiling more weapons to blow up the world twice over, and somehow it didn't happen. In 1991, the Soviet Union finally collapsed, after years of passive conflict with the U.S. Trillions of dollars were spent by both sides to make sure that neither attacked the other without fear of retribution. World War II seemed only a brief interlude between the ongoing conflict between the two countries. While neither openly attacked the other, there was always a fierce rivalry that only broke apart when one country's people became too tired of being oppressed by its government. In short, the U.S. was not the victor, merely the country that lasted the longest under the intense strain of being ready to go to war at any moment. Now things are different. Instead of being our rival and fierce competitor, Russia and the states that made up the Soviet Union are now on much better terms with our country. Communists are no longer hunted in the U.S., and there is no longer any use for our thousands of nuclear missiles. Ultimately, this compromised stability relies upon the decisions made by the upcoming generation and the leaders that emerge in the coming years.